The heat was no longer just a sensation, it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. My water bottle had been empty for 2 days, and the golden dunes of the Sahara had become a beautiful, undulating graveyard. I had accepted that I would never see my family again, that my body would be reclaimed by the shifting sands, and that my name would eventually be forgotten. But just as the world began to fade into a dark, cold blur, a shadow fell over me. In a place where no human should have been, a hand reached out. Who was this man, and how did he find me when the rest of the world had given up? The journey was supposed to be a simple expedition, a chance for me to capture the raw, unfiltered beauty of the desert through my camera lens. I have always been drawn to the edges of the map, to the places where the pavement ends and the real world begins. I packed my rugged off-road vehicle with what I thought was more than enough supplies: 20 gallons of water, preserved food, a satellite phone, and extra fuel. My plan was to cross a specific stretch of the desert that few tourists ever saw, a place of ancient rock formations and pristine, untouched dunes. As I set off from the last small outpost on the fringe of the wilderness, the locals watched me with a look that I should have recognized as a warning. But in my youthful arrogance, I mistook their concern for simple curiosity. The first few hours were magnificent. The sun painted the landscape in shades of ochre and gold, and the silence was a physical presence that felt both daunting and peaceful. I was in my element, driving over the hard-packed sand and stopping occasionally to frame a shot of the horizon. However, the desert is a deceptive beast. It lures you in with its beauty before it reveals its teeth. About 50 miles in, the engine of my car began to make a sound I will never forget. A rhythmic, metallic clanking that echoed across the empty plains. Before I could even pull over, a thick plume of white smoke erupted from under the bonnet. I hopped out, coughing as the acrid smell of burnt oil filled my lungs. I popped the latch, and the heat that rolled off the engine was more intense than the sun itself. A cooling hose had burst, and the radiator was bone dry. I wasn't panicked yet. I had my supplies, and I knew the basics of engine repair. I spent the next 4 hours under that hood, trying to patch the leak with duct tape and whatever materials I could find, but the damage was too severe. The heat of the day was peaking, and the metal was too hot to touch. I decided to wait for the evening to try again, but as the sun began to dip, a massive sandstorm appeared on the horizon like a wall of gray ghosts. I scrambled into the car, sealing the windows just as the wind began to howl. For 6 hours, the world disappeared. The sand blasted against the glass with the sound of 1,000 sandpaper sheets. When it finally stopped, the landscape had completely changed. My car was half buried, and the landmarks I had used to orient myself were gone. Worse yet, when I checked my gear, I found that the shifting weight of the car had caused the heavy crate to slide, crushing my water containers. Most of my life-sustaining liquid had drained into the thirsty sand. I was left with less than a liter of water, a broken car, and a dead satellite phone that refused to catch a signal. I sat in the driver's seat, the silence now feeling like a heavy shroud. I realized then that I wasn't just a visitor anymore. I was a victim of the vast, indifferent wilderness. I spent the first night calculating the distance back to the outpost. It was too far to walk, but staying with the car felt like waiting for an execution. I wrote a note in my journal, explaining what had happened, just in case someone found the vehicle. I didn't sleep. Every sound of the desert, the shifting sand, the cooling metal of the car, the distant howl of the wind, felt like a countdown. By the time the sun rose on the second day, the temperature was already climbing. I knew I couldn't stay in the metal oven of the car. I decided to pack a small bag with the remaining water and start walking toward where I believed the outpost was. It was a gamble, a desperate move born of the fear that if I didn't move, I would simply wither away. I took one last look at my vehicle, which now looked like a shipwreck in a sea of sand, and started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last as the sun began its relentless climb. By the afternoon of the second day, the reality of my situation had truly set in. Walking in the desert is not like walking on a beach. It is a grueling, soul-crushing battle against gravity and heat. For every 2 steps forward, your feet slide 1 step back into the fine, powdery sand. My throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper, and every breath I took seemed to suck more moisture out of my body. I rationed my water strictly, allowing myself only a tiny sip every hour, but it was never enough. The thirst was no longer a craving, it was a screaming demand from every cell in my body. My mind began to play tricks on me. I saw shimmering lakes on the horizon, perfect blue oases surrounded by lush green palms. I knew they were mirages, scientific phenomena caused by the refraction of light, but my heart ached to believe they were real. I would find myself walking faster toward them, only to watch them dissolve into more sand and heat as I approached. The loneliness was the hardest part. In the modern world, we are never truly alone, but here, there was nothing. No birds, no insects, just the endless, shimmering horizon. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice. I recounted memories of my childhood, the smell of rain on a London pavement, the taste of a cold lemonade on a summer afternoon. These thoughts were both a comfort and a torture. As the sun began to set on that second day, I found a small rocky outcrop and huddled beneath it. The temperature plummeted, and I went from shivering in the heat to shaking in the cold. I had no energy left to cry, though I felt the urge deep in my chest. I thought about my parents and how they would react when they received the news. I thought about all the things I hadn't done yet, the places I hadn't seen, and the words I had left unsaid. The third day was a blur of pain. My skin was blistered and raw, and my tongue felt too large for my mouth. I had finished my water the night before, and the dehydration was starting to affect my vision. I could no longer walk in a straight line. I stumbled and fell frequently, my hands scraping against the hot stones. Each time I fell, it took longer to get back up. The desert was no longer a landscape. It was a predator, patiently waiting for me to stop moving. I began to lose track of time. Was it still the third day? Or had a week passed? The sun was a cruel eye in the sky, watching my struggle with total indifference. I found myself kneeling in the sand, praying for rain, for a cloud, for anything to break the relentless glare. I started to hallucinate more vividly. I heard the sound of a car engine, the distant ring of a telephone, the voice of my mother calling me for dinner. I turned around, searching for the source of the sounds, but there was only the wind. I realized then that I was dying. The thought wasn't as terrifying as I expected. It was almost a relief. If I just lay down and closed my eyes, the pain would stop. The thirst would fade. I could just sleep. I collapsed at the base of a towering dune, the sand feeling strangely soft, like a warm blanket. I watched the sun beginning its final descent, casting long, purple shadows across the waste. I closed my eyes, ready to let go, feeling the last of my strength leak out into the earth. I was a speck of dust in a vast universe, and the desert was finally claiming its own. I don't know how much time passed while I lay there in the transition between life and death. The world had become a gray, muted place where the only thing I could feel was the faint pulse in my neck. But then, something changed. A shadow fell across my face, blocking the final rays of the setting sun. I assumed it was a cloud, or perhaps just the final shutting down of my optic nerves. But then, I felt a touch. It wasn't the harsh, biting wind or the abrasive sand. It was the unmistakable sensation of a hand on my shoulder. It was firm and warm. I forced my eyes open, but the light was too bright, and my vision was swimming with dark spots. Through the haze, I saw the silhouette of a man. He was tall, dressed in flowing, earth-toned robes that seemed to blend perfectly with the desert. He didn't say a word. He knelt beside me, his movements fluid and calm. I tried to speak, to ask for help, but all that came out was a dry, raspy wheeze. He reached into the folds of his garment and pulled out a small, intricately carved flask. He unscrewed the cap and gently lifted my head. As the first drop of water touched my lips, it felt like an electric shock. It was cold, impossible, freezing cold, and tasted sweeter than anything I had ever known. He didn't let me gulp it. He poured it slowly, a few drops at a time, allowing my parched throat to slowly wake up. I looked up at him, trying to see his face, but his features were obscured by the shadows and a light linen scarf wrapped around his head. Only his eyes were visible, and they were the most piercing, ancient eyes I had ever seen. They didn't look like the eyes of a person who had been struggling in the heat. They were calm, deep, and filled with a strange, quiet power. As the water began to work its way through my system, a flicker of strength returned to my limbs. The man stood up and offered me his hand. His grip was incredibly strong, pulling me to my feet as if I weighed nothing at all. He pointed toward the north, toward a direction I had convinced myself was the wrong way. He began to walk, and instinctively I followed. He didn't look back to see if I was keeping up, yet somehow, I found the energy to move. We walked in total silence. The desert around us seemed different now. The wind had died down, and the air felt cooler, almost breathable. The man's footsteps made no sound on the sand, and he left no trail that I could see. I struggled to keep my eyes on him, afraid that if I blinked, he would vanish like the mirages. I wanted to ask him who he was, where he came from, and how he had found me in the middle of nowhere, but the silence between us felt sacred. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full of a presence that demanded respect. We walked for what felt like hours, yet I didn't feel the same exhaustion as before. It was as if his presence was acting as a shield against the elements. Eventually, we reached the crest of a high dune, and there, in the distance, I saw the faint, flickering lights of a small encampment. My heart leaped. It was real. I turned to thank the man, to pour out my gratitude, but he was already several yards away, walking back into the deep shadows of the desert. "Wait!" I managed to croak out. He stopped for a brief second, looked back over his shoulder, and gave a small, solemn nod. Then, he stepped behind a rock formation and was gone. I scrambled toward the lights, my voice finding a bit of strength as I shouted for help. The people at the encampment were a group of local nomads and a small geological survey team. When they saw me staggering out of the darkness, they rushed toward me with blankets and more water. I was babbling, trying to tell them about the man who had saved me, but they just hushed me, telling me to save my strength. They took me into a tent, laid me on a cot, and began the slow process of rehydrating my body and treating my sunburns. I was safe, but my mind was stuck on that dune. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the robes. The next morning, a rescue helicopter arrived to take me to the nearest hospital. Before I left, I spoke to the leader of the nomads, an older man named Idris who had spent his entire life in the Sahara. I told him about the mysterious stranger who had found me when I was at death's door. I described his robes, his flask, and his silent, piercing eyes. Idris listened intently, his face grave and thoughtful. When I finished, he didn't call me crazy or tell me I was hallucinating from the heat. Instead, he looked out at the vast expanse of the desert and sighed. He told me that there are stories in the desert that go back thousands of years. He spoke of the guardians of the waste, spirits or perhaps hidden men who appear only to those who have truly lost all hope. He told me that I was not the first traveler to speak of a silent man in earth-toned robes who appears out of nowhere to offer water to the dying. Some call them angels, others call them ghosts, and some believe they are a hidden tribe of people who have mastered the desert in ways we cannot understand. Listening to him, a cold shiver ran down my spine, despite the heat. I realized then that according to every map and every survival expert, I should have been dead. I had walked in the wrong direction for miles. The man had led me on a path that didn't exist on my GPS, yet it brought me straight to safety. When I eventually got back to the city and looked at the satellite images of the area where I had been stranded, there was nothing but hundreds of miles of empty sand. There were no villages, no wells, and no reason for anyone to be out there on foot. The doctors at the hospital were amazed by my recovery. They told me that I had been severely dehydrated, but the water in my system was strangely pure, rich in minerals they couldn't quite identify. I kept the small flask the man had given me. I had tucked it into my jacket before reaching the camp. But when I went to show it to the doctors, the flask was gone. I searched every inch of my gear, but it had vanished. It was as if the desert had reclaimed its gift once the task was done. This realization hit me with a wave of profound emotion. I sat in my hospital room, looking at my bandaged hands, and I wept. I wasn't crying because of the pain or the fear I had endured. I was crying because I had been touched by something beyond my understanding. I had been at the very edge of existence, and something had reached out to pull me back. It changed the way I looked at everything. The petty stresses of my life, the career ambitions, the small arguments. They all seemed so insignificant compared to the raw reality of that desert and the kindness of that stranger. I understood then that life is a fragile, beautiful gift, and that sometimes we are watched over by forces we can't see or explain. I had gone into the desert to capture its beauty, but I came out with something much more valuable, a sense of wonder and a deep, abiding humility. It has been several years since that day in the Sahara, but the memory remains as vivid as the sun on the dunes. I returned to my life in the UK, but I am not the same man who left. I moved away from the hectic pace of the city and settled in a small coastal village where I can hear the rhythm of the waves. I still take photographs, but my focus has shifted. I no longer seek the extreme or the dangerous. I look for the small, quiet moments of grace in everyday life. I look for the way people help one another without being asked, the way a stranger holds a door or shares a smile. To some, my story is nothing more than a hallucination brought on by heat stroke and desperation. They talk about the brain's ability to create, third man, scenarios under extreme stress, a psychological phenomenon where the mind conjures a companion to help one survive. I've read the papers and listened to the experts, and while their science is sound, it doesn't explain the coldness of that water or the physical weight of that hand on my shoulder. I know what I experienced. I know that in my darkest hour, I wasn't alone. I often think about the man in the desert. I wonder if he is still out there, walking the shifting sands, looking for the next lost soul who has given up. I wonder if he is a man of flesh and blood or something more. But in the end, the what and the how don't matter as much as the why. His presence taught me that hope is never truly gone, even when the horizon is empty and the water has run dry. Kindness is a universal force, a thread that connects us all, even in the most desolate places on earth. It can appear in the form of a friend, a family member, or a mysterious stranger in the middle of a burning wasteland. My experience in the desert was a brutal lesson in survival, but it was also a beautiful lesson in faith. I learned that we are never as alone as we think we are. There is a balance to the world, a hidden hand that occasionally tips the scales in our favor when we need it most. I have shared my story with many people, and while some are skeptical, others find comfort in it. It serves as a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that we aren't meant to solve, only to experience. The desert is a place of harsh truths, but it is also a place of miracles. I still have my journal from that trip, the one where I wrote my final goodbye. I keep it on my desk as a reminder. Sometimes, when life gets difficult or the path ahead seems unclear, I close my eyes and I can almost feel that cool, minerals-rich water on my tongue. I can see those ancient, calm eyes watching over me. It gives me the strength to keep walking, to keep pushing forward, knowing that help can come from the most unexpected places. I am a survivor, not because of my own strength, but because of the kindness of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. And that, I believe, is the greatest story I will ever have to tell. The desert may be vast and indifferent, but it is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of those who came before and the quiet presence of those who watch over us. I found my way back home, but a part of my soul will always remain in those golden sands, forever grateful for the shadow that fell across my path when I thought the sun would never set. Life can often feel like a desert. Vast, overwhelming, and at times, completely hopeless. We all face moments where our resources run dry and we feel like we can't take another step. But if there's one thing my journey taught me, it's that you should never stop looking at the horizon. Help often arrives in the moment you least expect it, from sources you could never have imagined. Whether it's a stranger's hand or a sudden burst of inner strength, kindness is always nearby. Keep moving, keep hoping, and remember that even in the most desolate places, you are never truly alone.